Rick. Thanks to all of you for extending the invitation. And yeah, I was tempted by the Zoom offer, but it is actually more important to be here in person. Here with my evening, but you guys are worth it. So happy to have made the trip. Look, and I'm very happy to have an open conversation and answer questions or whatever, but a couple of things that I want to point out. One, I know that when I made the decision for us to pull out of the negotiations that have been going on for a long time, and I think we let you all know what our thinking and our reason behind that was. So one of the things I've tried very hard to do is make sure that even if we disagree on positions or even on tactics, that we're always in discussion and we're transparent about what we're doing. That's the basis, right? Honest people can have honest disagreements, but you let each other know. But some of that, what shaped my thinking there was a sense that we had frankly stopped talking about actually reaching an agreement and gotten into a situation where at least some participants in that multi-stakeholder interaction were doing more posturing. Frankly, we had to change the dynamic to get to a point where we were actually having a real conversation in a way that would work for both all of the watershed communities and for the city, because we have interests here too. Our needs and interests have to be taken into account as well. And I believe that over the last several years we've demonstrated a desire to be as good a partner as we can be. And I think 4 years ago, I know there were issues about DEP paying its bills, and I think we've done a good job of settling that. And I read the last report, Jason, and it's nicely summed up as nothing to see here, which I appreciate. And we took that very seriously. We had a hiccup a year ago around the Shokan treatment plant, and as soon as I found out about it, we fixed it. Because I think it's very important for us to be good to our it's less about this side of the watershed and more on the Ulster side, but made a lot of progress with the new IRA. There's a lot that I think we've done well on with a 10-year agreement with the WAC. A massive commitment on our part, and one that is, we didn't have to go to 10 years. We did it because we think those programs will stand the test of time. And we thought it was important to give that organization confidence in how well we're doing. So I think we've done a lot over the last several years to demonstrate that we think being, as I often say, an esteemed presence here in the watershed is something that we are taking very seriously. And we do, as I said actually to Tina, I think one of the first times we met, that FAD and what's in a permit, right, should be the floor and the ceiling to what DEP does as a key participant and member of the watershed community. But Rick, as you pointed out, one of the things, and I last time I was in this room, I think I was saying exactly this, that the current structure of the agreements dates from the 1990s. It addressed very well the risks to our water supply that were the big risks in the 1990s. And those risks have changed. And as a result, we have to take a look at what can and should change about the entirety of all of these programs and restrictions. And by the way, I understand it's not just about money, it's also about the restrictions that we impose or that the MOU imposes. And I think in light of the current changing climate, in light of changing water standards, in light of significant change in economic activity throughout the Hudson Valley over the last 30 years, we have to look at all of these programs clearly with an eye towards, are these going to be effective? Are they going to be cost effective? And is there anything that we've learned from the last 30 years that we should be using to refine these programs? That's not a one-sided effort. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to come up here is that I've read assertions that the DEP has given up on source water protection, that we've assumed that there must be filtration, that we are doing this just to save money or reduce costs. And I'd like to say very clearly, none of those three things is true. In fact, all of this from my point of view is that we have to be willing to change if we are going to avoid filtration. That source water protection is clearly valuable, but we have to do it in the right way, in the most effective way, and in the most cost-effective ways. And as far as I can tell, based on what we have seen about the challenges that we face in terms of continuing to avoid filtration, that our total spending will probably have to go up rather than down. But that said, I want to make sure that we are getting all the value we need and that we are spending our resources in the places where it will have the biggest impact. In fact, I remember remarking to Jason after the annual meeting here that I thought his presentation and his staff's presentation did an admirable job of talking about about program management that CWC does very closely on many of these programs. And the flip side of that is there needs to be efficiency analysis, right? What's the watershed impact per dollar invested? And I have to imagine that we have a shared perspective that public dollars, regardless of source, should be spent as wisely and efficiently as possible. And so everything that we've been doing here, at least from my point of view, has been towards the objective of setting us up not to target or cut any specific programs. I personally am absolutely agnostic about what programs should or should not continue, change, or be added. My objective with this is to make sure that the FAD process that we're going to be going through over the next 2 years includes an opportunity for a rigorous analysis. As you all know, next spring, DEP, this is mainly on Shiloh's desk, will be producing its analysis. Oh, yeah, Shiloh, what's it called?
We'll start with our 5-year FAD assessment.
5-year FAD assessment, right? Which we will use to look at how these programs are performing, right? So that gives us the beginnings of an opportunity to say, here's what we've produced, here's what we've spent, here's what the impacts are. We have a scientific program going on right now with a scientific advisory panel that's just been convened. We'll meet for the first time in person in 2 weeks, I think, 2 weeks. We've assembled that group. They are all scientists, mostly at universities. All of them have PhDs. These are not advocates or representatives. We've asked them, and they run the gamut from New England all the way as far afield as Arizona. We have one, so it's a national panel. And we invited both the Department of Health and DEC to identify a scholar that they trust, and we've put those 2 names are also on this panel. And that scientific advisory panel is going to review all of the science that we have developed that is informing our assessment of the risks to the FAD over the next decade or so. And from those risks, or from that analysis, we have begun to develop hypotheses about where our exposures are, what could cause a loss of the filtration avoidance determination. And therefore, certain extent, what I think we need to do is make sure that we are open to the equivalent of zero-based budgeting. To actually look at everything and say, if we were going to invent this anew, to be appropriate to the risks of 2025 or 2027, when it will take effect, what would we design? Which is the same thing that from the mid-1990s produced the system we currently have. I believe a lot of the programs we have probably stand that test pretty well. It stands to reason that septic systems are a better way to keep the water clean than end-type solutions. Okay, we just need to do the analysis. It stands to reason, as you know, we've come to the belief that very targeted land acquisition, rather than wholesale land acquisition, is the way to spend money wisely and have the biggest impact. Significantly, as we look at the whole system, one of the things that we have seen quite clearly is that the greatest risk, and this is one of the things we want our scientific advisory panel to check our math on, but it does seem to us like the biggest single point of failure to the FAD is actually not in the Weston Hudson reservoirs, but rather at the Kensico Reservoir. And I'm happy to go into more detail, Paul or Shiloh to back me up on the details there. But one of the salient points there, one of the reasons that I don't think we will be net spending less on FAD-related programming is that an acre of land in Armonk, New York does not cost 10 times what an acre of land, say, 30 miles north of here costs. It's 100 times. And if, as I think may be likely, we need to aggressively do more land acquisition around Kensico, that is going to be a significant increase in cost. There are also things that we may need to do around Kensico or some of the other reservoirs that is very much source water protection, but is for a different set of risks. Because one of the things that we've seen in our analysis is that we've actually done, because of the good programs that we've done a very good job of keeping human contamination out of the watershed, or out of the reservoirs. We've done a really good job of keeping agricultural contamination out of the reservoirs. 4 years ago, when we had a big spike due to the runoff that was caused by Hurricane Ida, our scientists looked at the contamination that had made its way into particularly the Kensico Reservoir and came to the conclusion that it was neither human nor agricultural, it was wildlife. All you know, particularly the people who live in Westchester and Putnam know that, particularly in that part of the world, the deer population, raccoons, birds, are all radically bigger in population than they were 30 years ago when the FAD was developed. And so that is a change that we have to take into account, because no amount of land acquisition and conservation easements will protect us from deer. And so we have to think about new strategies. I will stop because I don't want to take up all night, and I'm very eager to hear your questions or answer or go into greater detail on anything you'd like to hear from me on. But our goal is not to foreclose options right now. It is actually to make sure that we have the option to think broadly through this FAD process. And what we have been working against is the idea that without this rigorous analysis, that we would wind up through a water withdrawal permit for a program that's already complete, because the land acquisition program under the current FAD is now complete. To lock ourselves into 10 more years of programs that may or may not be the programs that we ought to have. And we will know what programs we ought to have 2 years from now. Right? when this FAD process is complete. So that's the reason behind where we've been and what I've been trying to accomplish. It is not at all that I think that we were a short-term partner. It's certainly not that I think we are moving towards filtration. Again, this is doing everything we can possibly do to avoid filtration. But as is often the case, actually succeeding is going to require us to change with the times. The science has changed, the economic and wildlife situation has changed, and the drinking water standards have changed. And so those things require us to ensure that our strategy is right. And that's my goal here. But I think our other efforts over the last several years should give a sense that we at DEP believe that our watershed partnerships are important and that we are eager to be a good partner. But we do need to have the ability to craft a new set of programs through a thoughtful process that will achieve its goals. And that's what we're trying to accomplish over the next 2 years.
So thank you, Rick. Paul, any comments?
This is different than the watershed. The challenges now are different. When I was hired back in '92, came
As a
back.
septic inspector originally, or just a design engineer, you told me to do that.
What's that?
You were hired originally as a septic.
Oh yeah, I was hired.
I
as the first
learned
guy.
that the other day, so I wanted to make that, as an engineer.
Yeah, when I came here in 1992, I was hired to do the septic system review in Neversink Rondout watershed. I mean, that was a lot of fun coming in to do that back then. We won't go into the stories.
No, just thought that was an important fact. No, well, give me 1 second. We laugh and we joke, but I think it is important to understand that people that have done the job appreciate the job. And I thought that was interesting the other day, so that's what I went for. I think it does give you a sense of understanding how it works.
And back at that time, what has also changed is we were fighting to get this filtration avoidance determination. So the city, and everyone knows in this room, how the city first came up with those really, really strong rules that helped form this group to fight the city. But even as we negotiated going forward, we had to prove that we were being very, very strict and protective of the watershed. Working with the communities, working with the environmental groups was important, but we had to demonstrate that. And that was the attitude we went forward, and that was the charge I was given when I first got here. A lot has changed since that time frame. We've proven the folks in the watershed are good partners, are interested in protecting the water, and we also have to make sure there's opportunities for economic growth, which I think we've done really, really well together. But that framework from back then, in the 1990s, we don't have to prove to EPA or to anyone that we need to establish ourselves as capable of doing this job. We've advanced in the past 30 years, and we're doing a really, really good job. And it makes sense to step back and see, even how we apply the regulations, how we do the regulations. There are professional engineers involved in every septic system that's installed in the watershed. There's a state rule now that requires that to happen. That wasn't the case back in the 1990s, where it was, anyone would go out there and put together, install a septic system. So a lot has changed. And it's important for us as part of this process to look at our programs, look at how we interact with the community, how we do our regulations, all as part of a package. And Jason, you brought that up in our conversation we had on Friday as well.
Hello, anything?
No, we're both separately.
So before we open it up for questions, just a couple of little thoughts, and then I'll start it off with a question or two, if you don't mind, Rick. But I do think one of the things I didn't say early on is it is an opportunity in negotiation very often to sometimes things need to be at the principal level, and I think that's important. And, I would encourage everybody around this table to think of their role as an elected official, and that role in what you're representing, not only as your home town or village, but also now as a member of the CWT, and think about what's best for the watershed, collectively as a group. And we have the opportunity, to ask those questions on the big picture about the future. So with that little, side note, one thing that struck me is, we had what we had believed was a very transformational report with the National Academies of Science. Maybe we thought it was more transformational than you did because we agreed with some of the things quite highly in there. But I think in general, I'm curious as to what drives, I understand your concept of the science, but why are we going out again to a new panel? And can you compare and contrast? Because one of the things I've heard is you want an independent panel because you don't agree with anything they said. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but I just wanted to have a little clarification on that.
Well, let me start, and then I'll ask Paul and Charlie to add. It's not that we don't agree with anything they say, but I do think that our concerns with the National Academy report is that it did not fully take into account either climate change or this change in the content and source of the pollution that is the threat. And that was really what opened my eyes. This point about wildlife contamination being the thing that caused the spike we had after Ida. Right, when I took over as commissioner, we were in the midst of an HA 5 violation that was still the hangover February from the storm that had been September 1st. Right, so it had a big impact. And realizing that the National Academy report was uninformed by that, and that was not the first time that was actually probably the moment when I realized we needed to think about it. And then, I also don't know that it took climate change as really into account as it could have. One of the things we've certainly seen, well, of course, there's a trend in the climate over the last 20 years, certainly as measured at Central Park, the 4 most intense rainstorms in New York City's entire recorded history have taken place in the last 4 years. So somehow, in around 2021, there was a bend in the curve. Maybe it'll revert back to the mean, I don't know. But it is consistent with all of the climate models that kink was going to happen, right? And so those rainstorm events that were not there in the record that the National Academy had looked at prior to 2020 really also shape a lot of our thinking. Paul, Shiloh, anything to add? Or did I not wrong?
On the Ida, so we had fecal coliforms going into Kensko. That was a big deal in Ida. But the bigger deal was organic material rushing into that reservoir. And this is the difference between the not the NIDWAC report, the NASEM report, and why we need to look at it again and look at it differently. In the National Academy's report, we did a system stress. We wanted to see what the worst possible storm we could handle using our OST, and we were focused on turbidity. And with the infrastructure investments we made between the Croton filtration plant, being able to operate that now at 290 MGD, the connection between the Catskill and Delaware Aqueduct down in Ulster County, and the ability to use alum if absolutely necessary, we have turbidity under control. We understand turbidity. What they looked at back during the NASEM report was looking at the new disinfection byproduct rule, the stage 2 that went into effect in 2012. During Hurricane Irene, we would have violated that rule. We put a lot in place to change how we operate the system ahead of that NASEM report to use organic contact in the reservoir as a criteria for making decisions on operations. We did a lot of that ahead of the NASEM report, and we're given credit for it. But what has happened is we are now getting these flash quick droughts like we had last year, and we just had one this past year, followed by big rain events. Ida happened after a very dry period with a lot of rain and rushed in a lot of organic matter, mainly around Kensico and West Branch. That got hit harder. that raised those organic compounds up to a point where we ended up violating the stage 2 disinfection byproduct rule, and it took us 2 quarters to get out of that. We thought we had that under control, and we presented that to the expert panel at that time that we had it under control. But the changes show that we don't have it under control. And the other thing that's happened is there's a proposed microbial disinfection byproduct rule where, to protect people from Legionella and other things, the National Drinking Water Advisory Council has recommended increasing the amount of chlorine that utilities have to maintain in their distribution system. And this is going to be this is a challenge to us to be able to comply with that rule altogether, given this organic loading risk that we now have with the way the climate has changed. And that was not there in this the NIDWAC report, and recommendations were not there when this report was done. And this rule could be in effect. Maybe this administration will hold off on rulemaking, but it could be 5-10 years where we may not be able to comply with that standard in the distribution system for the city. And we have to, our obligation is public health for the city of New York, and we have to have confidence in the water supply. So we have to take measures to make sure we're able to comply with that. And that's why this moment in this panel is necessary, and a difference in information that wasn't available at the time of the NASEM report. Charlotte, do you have anything?
I was just gonna offer on the microbial disinfection byproduct rule. Right now, we're anticipating EPA to have a final rule by 2028. As Paul said, unless something changes the administration, and that's 2028 is right around the corner.
As long as you have steep slopes and wooded watershed, that's always gonna be an issue too. There's really, right? What's the question?
We don't know what we don't know. Understanding the forest, and we're doing studies now to try to figure out what kind of forest produces the highest levels of disinfection byproduct precursors. We do know that Neversink has the highest, and we know that Candidville and Papacton are lower. And why that is, we need to understand the forest and the landscape and see what type of, because we're tied, we're going to be together for a long time. It's been a long time, it's been rough, but it's going to go on longer. The city's going to continue to need water. It's going to have to come from here. By the way, we bought a lot of land that we now control. Understanding the investments we need to make, or the type of land cover that we should encourage to grow there, the type of forest, we're working on that now. And, it takes a long time to change a forest, but we're going to be here a long time. And I'm sure, and you intend to be here as well. I guess you are, it's not just the folks in the room, it goes beyond us. I'm speaking more generally.
Well, just a follow up on something I thought I heard you say, that you're adding alum to the reservoir. And so my question is, being a shoemaker, so I don't know the answer, is you're adding alum to the reservoir. Is that also driving some of the reasons that they're doing the water releases in terms of into the surface? And maybe you can just sort of expand upon that. Is that
Sure. So we got a permit to add alum to the Catskill Aqueduct back in 2005. And that allows us to periodically add alum from the turbidity side.
Just say what alum is.
Okay,
Because
alum.
I think there's a lot of people that might.
Sorry about that. Alum is aluminum. It's aluminum hydroxide. It's aluminum with a hydroxide on the end of it. Does that help? No. So it's used commonly in drinking water plants to cause settling of solids. It coagulates, it drops things out, and has an electrostatic charge that pulls particles together. And in the Catskill watershed in particular, the small clays have a negative charge, they attract to the positive, and it drops out. We have the permit to add alum, but we can only add it if absolutely necessary. It's very effective in dropping turbidity. The last time we did it was during the shutdown last year. We added the Catskill Aqueduct to keep down the level of turbidity in Catskill. It works, but our first course of action before we add alum is to use more Croton water, use more Delaware water, because Delaware water tends to be less turbid, and when we have turbidity problems in the Catskill system, it's usually after a big rainstorm or a big event, so we tend to have more water in the Delaware. So those are our go-to methods. Allen is helping, and that's our last resort measure, but we have the ability.
So
to do
normally what you're doing is you're allowing the reservoir to settle and let it naturally to filter down, to drop.
That's right.
And, okay.
And actually, that's why we were able to redo the IRP and end the turbine releases. Because as Paul pointed out, due to the interconnection of Catskill and Delaware, unlike a decade ago, we now can actually turn off the Ashoka from the water. Right? It's so big that previously we basically could not supply the city without it. And now with that interconnection, we can.
So as we're having these more intense weather events that are obviously affecting the east of the Hudson, it's also affecting us here on the west of the Hudson. We're experiencing these in Northern Mountain communities. So the amount of turbidity that's getting into the Schoharie and such and coming down is also rising. So in terms of the continuation on some of the programming that was with the streamside acquisitions and stuff, with the idea of trying to be able to have your buffer zones, how do you see all that moving forth and staying in basically the toolbox?
So at Schoharie, we've also done other things. We have another project in mind that's going to help us with turbidity there. We now, at Schoharie Reservoir, with the reconstruction, we now can take water not just from the bottom of Schoharie, we can actually take it from the top of the water column as well. And that's helped us with both turbidity and also temperature for trout fishing downstream of the Silvers. We're going to be putting in a high-level intake at Gilboa Dam as well. That's going to further help us to manage that. When we have these really, really, really big storms, that's when we have the turbidity problems. I mean, that's when we have the biggest challenges. The stream work we do, I mean, that helps with baseline conditions. It does a great job in lowering it at baseline conditions. And there's some evidence that after storms, it helps it drop somewhat more quickly. But those projects are not going to help us. I mean, when you have those really, really big storms, they don't really help you that much. And the USGS is going to come out with a study. They're working on a study on this right now.
As you look at the forest, you're saying trying to see how low the organic load, you see a lot more. Do you anticipate having a lot more intensive stewardship of your lands that you own in order to manage that? Like, what are you kind of picturing on your lands?
I mean,
We don't yet know what it is, right? But I think what the question is Paul described that we are asking is, can we manage the forest that we own in a way that does an even better job of the filtration, right? Broadly defined, right? Not producing the organic matter as well as right now. But I think that, the reason, and Rick, you pointed out that of course, as you all know, FAD is globally recognized as the most significant ecosystem services agreement there is pretty much anywhere. We are trying to think about how do you think even more deeply about ecosystem services? So I don't think we know yet what the answer to your question is. What do we do differently? What I know is I think we are asking the right question, which is it possible to imagine that a different way of thinking about the forest as opposed to just like, okay, we got it, let's keep it out of development and let's leave it be, right? That's been our strategy thus far. Do we think differently about it? And can that yield benefits to us? That's the question. I don't know, but it does suggest that what we're contemplating is some more active management of what that actually looks like and whether it'll work. That's what we're trying to figure out.
Sort of pushing for a little more stewardship. On the other hand, has some concerns about going too far. The other.
Look, and again, this is the kind of thing that we want to make sure we have the space through this FAD process to really ask. Now, some of this research is not necessarily going to be complete by the time we have to figure out the agreeing to a fad where we continue the research, or maybe there are some pilots or tests, I don't know, and I don't wanna prejudge. Again, my goal here is not to prejudge. My goal here is to make sure that we are creating the conditions for a thoughtful, data-driven, analysis-based approach to crafting the program that should be after 2027.
Following up on the organic, how much is eutrophication from the east?
Probably very little. They provide feces, they provide coliform lowering. But where we have our compliance points for that fecal coliform, we have really, really active ESS management programs. But they are irritating, that's not.
I know it comes from, the Wilson at one point, where you put in a filtration plant on the same.
Yeah, I mean, exactly right.
And of course, Dover actually put the plane to swim in the Pepsico.
What do you do at Kingsco?
Or Pepsico, and eutrophication, that was a word I learned from one of these lawyers.
You can still use them. Jason?
Gonna go.
Other first, go ahead. Others? Go ahead, sort of.
I'd just like to repeat what Rick said. I think the communication is really important, and just being able to talk out what the positions are, I think goes a long way. And I think it's great that he came up here so we could talk about some of these things. I think it's been frustrating for some of the locals over the last couple of months, just trying to figure out what exactly the city position is, what you're doing over these last handful of months. But now that we are back to the table, I think that's good, and I think we're making progress. I think something that came up in both your and Paul's talk today, which has been missing in some of the other discussions, which has caused a little bit of concern, is not just the shift of what programs from an environmental perspective, but addressing the restrictions and the regulations as well. We have heard, at least I have at CWC, and my concern has been, if we are moving away from existing programs because they might not be the most beneficial, that's not irrational, and we understand that. But part of that agreement in '97 was that the locals wouldn't be straddled with those regulations and costs. So to hear it tonight, I think pretty much for the first time, that is part of the evaluation too, not just a shift away from the programs. I think collectively that is a sigh of relief for us, that the concern isn't, that the programs just simply go away and we have to pay for septic or stormwater or wastewater regulations, which are costly. We see what these costs are. If it's an entire overview, I think that's something we're all willing to come to the table and talk about, as long as it's a full picture discussion, not just a shifting of resources from the watershed, because it's a socio-economic agreement as well, not just a water quality thing. So as long as we're all on the same page that we can work collectively that way, I think you'll have partners with us. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think we're willing to discuss those realities. We just don't want to be strapped down the road. We appreciate it.
Look, that's, now, I'm sorry if it did not come across that we were trying to look internally as well. It's possible I didn't say that out loud when I was here in April, but it was certainly something that we've been talking about. Was that, Paul and Shiloh wouldn't even let me come up, but I made them do a day-long workshop in Kingston where they were whiteboarding and thinking about what could change, but I was not invited. But look, and I think one of the healthiest things that could come out of this is frankly for you to help us identify the things we need to be interrogating in the same way, right? Which restrictions, as Paul pointed out, we don't have to kill ourselves to be more Catholic than the Pope to get credibility with EPA. We've got 30 years of performance that gives us credibility with EPA, right? ability collectively, right, to say, well, all right, here's how this whole arrangement can be fine-tuned. And again, the likelihood that the right answer is no restrictions and no septic program, I think that's a really low likelihood, right? But I think if we don't allow ourselves to ask the question, we will be stuck doing things the old way, and eventually that will fail. So, hold us to that. Like, you should be asking us, like, this is something else that needs to be assessed or whatever. We will be open to that.
I want to thank.
Glenn wants to go. Go ahead.
Being a newly elected official, it's all learning curve, I think. The watershed, water protection has been wildly successful. And possibly too successful in the sense, I'm looking at it from an economic development perspective. That there's a large influx, our economy is based on people wanting to come up to the city and enjoy the open spaces and a lot of the properties, the trails, the hiking that the city owns, property the city owns, the hiking, fishing, and all of the outdoor recreation, which is important from a local perspective as well as from residents that permanently live in the city. So a lot of the things, a lot of the barriers that we run up against as we explore looking at ways to enhance that experience of lodging or some additional housing for service industries, for service workers, for workforce housing. It bumps up against conversations like a land swap opportunity, or if there's capacity with existing sewer plants that we, look have to in many regards connect to for water, public sewer, key components, and a very good component of those developments. But we struggle, I struggle at least, trying to understand where we can, what's appropriate development, where are the areas, if we had a developer, Margaretville, we could use a hotel, I don't know where you're staying tonight. There's not too many choices here in Margaretville, so to me, that would be a development that is, that could be environmentally friendly, definitely economic sustaining, needed, but I'm not sure what the capacity is of the sewer plant to accommodate that. And it's a challenge understanding, am I hitting the cart in front of the horse in some of those conversations? So I know I'm drilling down maybe a little bit into the weeds here, but when we talk about, working collaboratively, there has been great programs in the past. Visioning going forward, where do you see, if you had my hat on, how would you be looking and addressing these questions that I'm getting on a daily basis from the city?
Well, look, for what it's worth, the question you're asking is the one that I would be asking, as you say, if I were in your shoes, right? And I think it may be one of the other things that we could, kind of building on Jason's point, we should think about being open to. My impression, right, despite the fact that you all have had a great relationship with Paul these many years, and he's a local and a native and one of you in that sense, is that because of a lot of the tension, we kind of walk on eggshells with each other, right? And I know this, why would I do this? You're not gonna do that. One of the things that he said, no, we don't do that, is when I said, well, could you imagine doing a joint economic development strategy? And, I know that 30 years ago that was like not something, given the dynamics, that could ever be contemplated. I wonder if we've grown up enough that maybe we could. Because the question you're asking is exactly right. Like, it should be in DEP's long-term interest to have a healthy economy here that takes shape in a way that is highly consistent with watershed protection at a reasonable cost. And again, I think some of the tradition has been to bristle at the idea that the city might have any role, and I don't think we want to impose an economic strategy, but insofar as greater development that might be very nice and compact, completely connected to the sewer system, requires us to make investments in the plan. Is that outrageous? I don't think so, as long as it's planned, as long as it's agreed upon, as long as it makes sense for both sides. Right. Now, I don't quite know how to do that in a way that wouldn't feel like we're coming in and imposing a vision, but that's not actually our goal. But it feels like it might be an opportunity somehow.
Can I clarify what I actually said? I said the economic study should be led by the community, by CWC. We shouldn't be leading this economic study.
Okay.
But the question that was posed is a question that every single community has, and those that have central systems, as you do, as the town, as Townsville does, in the town of Hunter, is absolutely the question at hand, is what's the capacity, and what does that allow, and then how does that allow the local communities to be able to utilize that capacity?
And that's what we discussed as part of this process, was the I&I is one of the biggest restrictions we have in terms of, you know, our own plans and having capacity. It's so important to have that capacity to people that I&I.
Well, the second piece of,
Well,
if,
infiltration.
no, I know that, but if we control that, getting that capacity to the community, you know, to use it effectively is important, which you and I have discussed.
Well, and also your point about land swaps. I mean, we've talked about this, right? I mean, I think having the ability for us collectively is kind of in the same spirit as, all right, we've bought enough land in priority areas 3 and 4. Now let's figure out how we get the best bang for the buck out of land we have. Land swaps is a similar thing, right? We've been engaged in property acquisition for 25 plus years. I guess actually 28, something like that. But for a generation. And as you all know, it's a little bit willy-nilly what land winds up in our portfolio, right? It would be fantastic for us to spend the next decade refining that so that it's more rational. And, you know, one of the issues there is we need the freedom from the state to do so in a way that really makes sense and can proceed quickly. But if we could do that, I think there's a lot of value on both sides.
One of the challenges when you say the state, DEC, I'm presuming we're talking about, in terms of it, we're talking about the conservation easements that are on the properties. I mean, I'm thinking about Chandaken and their facility down here, they need to get out and move. Is that what's holding it up? And what is a good suggestion on how to try to work on that?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yes, so it is the conservation easements that are the holdup, and because it's not been done before, DEC does not have a defined process on how to go about extinguishing easements and doing something different. So as far as the Chandaken and the land swap here across the street that we've been actively working on, we are waiting for DEC to define their process so that we can move forward, because we do support these especially these particular swaps. But they need to work through their process before we can work through our process with you all.
You're being too nice. It's not a difficult process. They just have to make a decision and to move it forward. And I appreciate you coming up here and your attitude on all of this. And I think it's an opportunity to reevaluate where everything is going. So if you realize back in the 90s when you were getting your first ballot, it was literally the MOA, and the programs, the watershed protection programs that we developed, were basically designed to mitigate the impacts of that. Force the city to make investments up here, in upgrades to treatment plants and stuff, which it was considering, and get mitigation for the regulatory programs. And we have views that are not criticizing you at all, the realization that when you have major storm events, you have the overloading from the animals and the critters up there. We said back in 94, 95, when the watershed, when the upgrades to the tertiary treatment on the sort of treatment plants was being proposed, that there were literally more white-tailed deer west of Hudson than there were people, and that you were cleaning up water to a point that was terribly clean and then putting it into a stream already had purpose for the variety from the other side. It wasn't necessarily cost effective. But again, because you were forced to put everything into it, and knew that you were doing it, and then when the program started developing and you were spending millions on tiny treatment plants to upgrade it, and certain New York City officials said, "This is ridiculous." And I said, "Yes, we told you that." It's an opportunity to revisit all of those things. And I think the coalition is willing to be a partner and reevaluating where those needs are. Obviously, we have to protect our communities. To the extent there remains a regulatory burden on us, those costs have to be borne by the city. The attempt is to not only avoid filtration, but assure you've got a multi-barrier protection there to make it happen. And that's what we're most concerned about. And we know the intentions of everyone are good. The implementation is always a problem. And it's human nature. And so we want to make sure that the communities have the tools and the resources to protect their interests moving forward and work together with you to make that cost effective. We have to deal with the state. They, come along and cooperate on this process. I know I would ask, it hasn't always happened in the past, but I think we're getting back to that stage. The coalition would like to be more closely involved in the development of the VAT, since we know what that's going to be, the mechanism going forward, and having good conversations with WOH. The water supply permit was a mechanism for it in the past because it was the legal mechanism to force the city to pay attention to us. And it was very effective at that time. We don't necessarily need that at the same point now. It's a mature program. And I think that's what everybody here is looking for. And, I think, your commitment to continue the basic programs as necessary to propose their reassuring.
Well, and if I could build on your point, which I appreciate very much, that was the spirit, because you said we're back at the negotiating table. Our suggestion that maybe we enter into an IGA is either alongside, or if there is a delay and we wind up in a gap period in the watershed permit. First of all, I'm just gonna say, if the permit expires and we have no IGA, we're still gonna fund the programs. Because, again, our goal is not to save a penny and alienate all of you and be an untrustworthy partner. We wanna be good for our word, and we wanna be a good partner. What we're trying to figure out is what's the best mechanism and construct in which to undertake this. I appreciate that the water withdrawal permit allowed an enforceability that, and I acknowledge, I think the city certainly early on, maybe even more recently, has not always been the partner that it should be. Again, I think we've grown a lot in this relationship, particularly perhaps over the last several years, and I would hope that we can do things differently. Jason will remember last summer when I called you about the letter.
Can I say something? I'd like to say, firstly, thank you for coming out and meeting with us. Because I
gonna say, for me, the big thing, eye-to-eye contact, because you can tell where the person's coming from, not on the camera or something like that. And it really shows how important it is to you. I live in the city, I've been living here for 25 years, but I know the drive. I'm gonna have to come up here, how long it takes and all that. But it shows an interest on your part of really caring. Each one of our communities, we all belong to the watershed, but we all each have individual issues that we're dealing with. I come from Walton, we have one of the biggest wastewater treatment plants in the watershed. And one of our big issues, was I keep talking to death about, is I-9. And we had a project that we were looking at, it was a $3 million project just to clean up all the I&I. And I was trying to say, Jeff is bringing that point to the city, that if they help us clean this up, that means the stuff coming into the plant is cleaner, we need less chemicals, we need less man-hours, and so everybody wins on this. And so most of our communities feel the same way. We want to work with the city, but again, and again, by you coming up here, shows that you're willing to at least talk to us. Another question I have, you said that you're gonna have a 2-year study in this program. So, are we gonna be able to sign some kind of agreement, even though we're waiting for 2 years for the study to come up? Because when the study is done, you'd be able to make a more comprehensive decision on what you wanna do. So have you thought about that?
It's a good question. Let me be clear. The analysis that we are focused on right now will be complete by the end of 2026. It was 2 years because we actually have already started a lot of work on it. Which is why, for example, we've done the scientific analysis that is ready to show to external scientists. But, I think like this forest management question, there are some things that we know we're not gonna have final answers to, right? And so there will have to be some kind of plans to plan embedded. But we do think that there is enough time in 2026 to have a thoughtful assessment and craft a set of programs that is robust for the next decade.
On that note, and the joint economic programs, in a way by default, with all the land the city owns and working with the communities and organizations on outdoor recreation, is a very good example of compatibility with watershed protection and economic vitality for the communities up here. So when the analysis is over, the scientific analysis, I don't think will show anything about, wow, we have this wonderful trail network up here in Hunter or Margaretville or that is going to lend itself to the scientific protection and validity of the watershed protection. Coming back to the community concerns and the economic viability and compatibility with the watershed, I would strongly encourage CWT and everybody in the room here, as the process moves forward in the next 2 years, that the whole potential for elevating the outdoor recreational improvements that have occurred in the last 10+ years, that be looked at in the short and the long term, because Lord knows most of the people that are coming up here are coming from New York City or the metropolitan area. And I think that just as a pitch, because I've worked with the city natural resource division on trail projects in Greene County, and it's a phenomenal win-win for both. So to that point, when the process plays out and the FAD is renewed and there's a lot of discussion back and forth, I think there is a whole area to be further cultivated with the watershed communities.
I could not agree with you more. I think one thing I would observe is that the FAD and the water withdrawal permit, going back to your point, at the moment have included everything. I find that a little troubling because I think there's a very big difference between the things you do for the purposes of the FAD and the things you do because DEP, whether on the flip side of what like it or not, we're gonna have you all as neighbors and relatives for a very long time, right? So, it should be in the city's interest to do things, as, you know, and of course, so much of the credit for this goes to Paul in terms of appreciating that the recreational uses are completely compatible, right? As long as there's good steam cleaning, completely compatible with our water supply objectives, right? I am still enthusiastic about the mutual benefit that could come from thinking strategically about a cell phone tower network on DEP property, right? That would make our operations better and easier, but also would allow our property to be used to address a significant economic need here, right? Those are just two examples. I'm not convinced, for example, as enthusiastic as I am about the cell phone effort. I'm not sure I want to give DEC the right to weigh in, just to be honest, right? Because it's not something we're doing because of environmental stewardship. We're doing it to be a good, effectively corporate citizen. Put that in quotes. But I think those things are clearly in the city's interest, and if we can work together on them, whether it's through an IGA or some other mechanism, I think it would be entirely appropriate to think about what's next and to put it in some sort of agreement.
I'd like to continue on where Glenn was talking about the economic development aspect of this. Currently, in Delaware County, our economic development plan is we find a piece of property and say, can we build here? Is it cost effective? Sewer plants, all of those things come into effect. Water. It is not the best location for the business, but it's one of the few locations available. The best locations are already owned by the city now. So land swapping is the whole future of Delaware County, and without it, our expansion is going to be less than what it's been in the past. The best location is near the sewer plants, and because of the cost of it, to build a septic system or a small sewer system 15 miles away from the town is just not cost effective. And it just puts that business out of reach for our area. We have a lot of businesses coming up from the city who are small, but they can't go nowhere. There's nowhere to go. Now, Glenn is pointing out we need hotels and motels. Are we putting them in the best spot? We're putting them where there's only spot available. It's not the best location. We had one built on Route 10 in Hamden. It's doing okay. It's a smaller hotel because of the cost factor to it. And most people are going to Margaretville or the bigger looks, and there's no place to stay there. There just isn't, because of this factor that the city already owns the most productive land available. So I think we need to be looking at land swapping as more than a wish list. It has to come through, or we're never going to succeed at all here. It's going to get more difficult.
I hear you, and I think maybe that, maybe there is something we do together that's, actually, talk about this, we talked about this too, right? Having, we were over at, year and a half ago in that conversation.
And I think one of the things that jump in is, you know, Paul and I have talked, and if you talk about programs or funding to directly enhance water quality, it's one group. To work on economic vitality or, you know, community stewardship, et cetera, is a different group. And maybe the longer term plan is that partnership where you allow more local control, take out some of the challenges of working with the bureaucratic, you know, organizations, to allow small pots of money to do good studies, to figure out good work, right? So that we can operate better over time. And, you know, you and I have talked about land swaps since that day I met you. You said it was one of the most important things we did. And I wanted to do a little one in Eversink just to, we have to get one done, right? I mean, it's so important for watershed. So I think there are opportunities, and that work together should be joint because we are partners. I really deeply appreciate you coming. The last comment that I would have that I think would be helpful for everybody in the room as we talk about this side agreement, right, whatever we want to call it, give us the sense, because you've given me the sense, so that can make it not as well as you mentioned. So I'm going to put you on the spot. Is what's your timing? I know we all want to get this done, and I think with an opportunity Wednesday in Kingston to make good progress, in the spirit of what you said, what are your objectives and thought process for that? If that's not too much of an imposition.
No, it's fine. Appreciate that always cuts to the chase. If I could though, before I answer, can I just, one observation on what you said? I mean, maybe the starting point is not some economic master strategy, which often gets kind of collapses under its own weight. But what we had talked about at one point ago was a strategic portfolio look at the land the city owns, land that could be swapped for it, right? Right now, we're doing some one-offs, right? And one-off swaps are better than no swaps. What you're talking about is really a strategic set of swaps, right? It says, oh, here's where we could have an economic development cluster that would have access to the sewage treatment plant and, you know, whatever. And okay, but if the city owns that, where do we find the property that we could swap for it? Like, that's an economic development strategy. That's what my colleagues at the New York City Economic Development Corporation do all the time, right? And I think it would be a wonderful thing for us to work together on. To Paul's point, the towns, of course, would have to tell us where you think is attractive. You know, we might have an opinion about runoff or something like that, but that's obviously for you to do. But that
Got a
feels
program
like
for
something.
that.
Sorry.
We got a program for that.
But in any case, it's just an idea. But Rick, to your question, look, I would love to get the IGA nailed down as quickly as possible. I was a little bit surprised at how it played out because when we offered it, I thought we were doing so in the spirit of just saying, hey, you know, there were negotiations. We had reached agreements on a lot of things. I expressed, you and I spoke about this when we withdrew from the negotiations. Our goal was not to renege on anything we had agreed on. And my thinking on offering an IGA was to be clear. We're not trying to renege on anything. We want to sign. Right? I was a little bit frustrated at what that evolved because a bunch of things got kind of Christmas treed onto it when it came back to us, which I thought was not in the spirit of that. And frankly got back to the dynamic that had led me to say it was time to pull out because it felt like it was more posturing or grabbing than kind of usually working towards an agreement. But if you know, if we are reasonably close and it really is about going back to those things that we had agreed upon as of last summer, I would hope we could get it done relatively quickly.
Now all the discussion here, and we get into the weeds on things that we have to see how the parts. Agree to a framework.
So, thank you all for coming. I really do appreciate it. I hope everybody in the room does appreciate it. We've enjoyed conversations from Shiloh and Paul at various points in time. I think it is always helpful to have a dialogue. I remind you at this point that I'm here and we're here as principals. So if it gets lost in lawyer land, etc., feel free to reach out. And I say that in jest, but the truth is, conversations matter. And you and I have had good ones over the years. And I would encourage everybody to do the same. So with that, I suggest maybe a 5-minute break or 10-minute break to give the city, everybody a chance to say thank you to them individually, etc. And then we'll resume if that's okay. Is that good? Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.